Task Force 64 had been looking for the incoming Japanese fleet for several hours. After the crushing Allied defeat in the Battle of Savo Island, the Americans were in dire need of a victory, and they were resolved to get it that night. It was late on October 11th, 1942, when Admiral Norman Scott finally received a message from one of his scout planes that said, quote, "1 large, 2 small vessels, 1 6 miles from Savo off Northern Beach, Guadalcanal. We'll investigate closer." Until now, the Americans hadn't even been close to defeating the Japanese at night encounters. So much so that the enemy would sneak in the darkness and convey reinforcements and supplies to Guadalcanal as it pleased. But at 10:50 p.m. that fateful day, contact was made. The Battle of Cape Esperance was about to begin, and the Americans braced themselves for a crucial confrontation that could change the course of the war. Tropical twilight. The Allied forces landed on Guadalcanal in early August of 1942. As they captured an airfield that the Japanese were building known as Henderson Field, the Allied aircraft were soon able to dominate the sea lanes around the island. That is, during daylight. It was a fair assumption at the time that the Americans were less than adept at fighting at night, and the Japanese would seize the advantage and deliver reinforcements to the island. The effort, carried out by smaller and faster destroyers, came to be known as the Tokyo Express, and impressively, the Japanese warships based in the Shortland Islands would make the run to and from Guadalcanal before sunrise. In October, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa plotted a major convoy to bring reinforcements to Guadalcanal, including heavy howitzers and field guns. The force, consisting of 6 destroyers and 2 seaplane tenders, was under the command of Rear Admiral Takatsugu Jojima. An additional force, led by Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto, consisting of 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers, was ordered to shell Henderson Field as a diversion, while the convoy delivered the troops ashore. While the Americans had lost several cruisers and destroyers in night encounters against the Japanese, they hadn't sunk a single enemy warship. Thus, the reinforcement group would arrive even before the Japanese bombardment group. As naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison put it, quote, "The Americans ruled the waves from sunup to sundown. But when the tropical twilight performed its quick fade-out, and the pall of night fell on Iron Bottom Sound, Allied ships cleared out like frightened children from a graveyard." Serendipity. On October 8th, the U.S. 164th Infantry departed New Caledonia and sailed to the island. Similarly, Vice Admiral Robert Gormley assigned Rear Admiral Norman Scott's Task Force 64 as a screen for the convoy. The task force included USS San Francisco, Boise, Helena, and Salt Lake City cruisers, and the destroyers USS Fahrenholt, Duncan, Buchanan, McCalla, and Laffey. After a short station off Rennell Island, Scott received reports that Japanese ships had been sighted in the slot. Then, on the 11th, his force sailed north. Early that day, both Japanese groups had departed the Shortlands and cruised down the slot, the route utilized by Tokyo Express missions. They were heading for Guadalcanal, but they didn't know the Allies had plans to reinforce the island as well. The Japanese then executed aerial raids on the airbase during the day, attempting to deter the Americans from Jojima's ships. However, Rear Admiral Scott was more concerned with the Americans' previous failures at night battles, and thus conceived a simple battle plan. He formed his ships into a column, with destroyers at the head and rear, and if they came across any targets, they were to illuminate them with searchlights so the cruisers could accurately engage them. At 10 p.m., Scott ordered a scouting sortie, and roughly an hour later, one of his own flagship's float planes sighted enemy ships. Another half an hour later, the Americans reversed course to cover the passage between Savo Island and Cape Esperance and get in a position to intercept the approaching enemy force. But the change of course in the darkness caused confusion, and the 3 lead destroyers ended up parallel to the rest of the column rather than in line. Making matters worse, Goto's force suddenly popped up on American radars, but Scott believed they were his own destroyers and took no action. Crucial mistakes. Goto was not expecting to face the Americans that night. In fact, the Japanese admiral was just as confused as his counterpart and believed the ships in his path were from Jojima's reinforcement group. Meanwhile, with a more powerful SG radar than the flagship San Francisco, Helena reported radar contact 27,000 yards away and incoming. Soon after, Boise confirmed 5 unidentified ships approaching the fleet. But Scott still thought the signals were coming from his own detached ships. On his part, Goto had to rely on the eyesight of his lookouts, given that his ships did not have radar. However, he was unconcerned when his sailors detected 3 silhouettes ahead of the flagship Ioba at 11:43 p.m. Goto had no reason to suspect the ships were American, and he slowed down and sent the recognition signal. As both fleets came closer, the Japanese guards confirmed the ships were from the enemy. Still, Goto ordered the signal to be flashed again. Perhaps due to sheer luck, Helena's crew was not as confused as its leader. When the range became a mere 5,000 yards, the Japanese ships were already visible to the naked eye, and American Captain Gilbert C. Hoover addressed San Francisco, quote, "Interrogatory, Roger." Scott acknowledged the message and answered, quote, "Roger." To his surprise, Hoover interpreted the word as permission to open fire, and at 11:46 p.m., Helena's 5 main 6-inch guns and other 5-inch guns rained fire on the Japanese lead ship. The rest of the cruisers immediately followed and opened fire, hitting Ioba over 40 times. Goto kept signaling, quote, "I am Ioba," as he believed they were under friendly fire. By then, it was too late to recognize his mistake. The shells from the American cruisers suddenly destroyed the ship's turrets and knocked out her fire control director and communications. The flag bridge was then smashed, and Goto didn't survive. Blind Man's Bluff. Ablaze and rendered vulnerable without her main guns, Ioba then turned to disengage. At 11:47 p.m., Scott was still concerned that he was attacking his own ships in order to cease fire, while the destroyers confirmed their positions. 4 minutes later, the Americans resumed their fire and destroyed the cruiser Furutaka. As this ship lost power and burned down, Scott's fleet turned to the destroyer Fubuki and sank her. Meanwhile, the cruiser Kinugasa and the destroyer Hatsuyuku attempted to flee from the battle, but Boise chased them down. At 12:06 a.m., the cruiser was warned about incoming torpedoes. Then, trying to illuminate the enemy with her searchlights, Boise took a hit to her magazine. The disorganized and scattered Japanese retreated roughly 15 minutes later, and Scott broke off the action. Still, the battle was not entirely one-sided. As Scott had feared, the destroyer Duncan got caught in the crossfire and endured both Japanese and American hits. Although the destroyer turned on her recognition lights, 4 shells from the American side put out the ship's power. In addition, the hits jammed the rudder full left, and Duncan spiraled out of the battle zone. Fahrenholt was also in between the 2 bands, and shrapnel fragments fell on her deck and activated a torpedo that was about to be fired. Luckily, it failed to explode, but the destroyer suffered another 3 6-inch hits that damaged her communications, fire control circuits, and the fire room. Listing, the ship sought refuge behind San Francisco and abandoned the fight. The American formation was no longer in line and had scattered through the area. The battle was said to be like a game of blind man's bluff. Renewed hope. For the Americans, the victory at the Battle of Cape Esperance came at the cost of the destroyer Duncan and 163 lives. Moreover, both Boise and Fahrenholt were gravely damaged. The Japanese had more considerable losses, including a cruiser, 3 destroyers, and over 400 sailors. Ioba was also severely damaged and unable to return to action until February of 1943. The encounter was the first Allied triumph over the Japanese during night hours. And while it was a tactical victory for Scott, the engagement had little strategic significance in the big picture, as Jojima was still able to deliver the reinforcement troops to Guadalcanal. Upon learning of the complications the Japanese bombardment force was enduring on the island, the Admiral detached 4 of his destroyers to support his compatriots after the troops had disembarked. However, the next day, Murakamo and Shirayuki were also sunk by aircraft based at Henderson Field. Then, on the night of October 13th, the battleships Kongo and Haruna bombarded Henderson Field, almost leveling it to the ground, with a total of 918 14-inch shells. The following day, another 4,500 Japanese troops were successfully delivered to the island, and they continued to harass the airstrip for several days as they prepared for the large land offensive on October 23rd. Still, the Americans had run off with a much-needed victory. Despite the luck factor, Technological advancements, coupled with adequate preparation, gave the Allies the upper hand that night, giving the weary troops a morale boost. As historian Morrison put it, quote, "At the very depth of this winter of our discontent came the Battle off Cape Esperance, which, if far short of glorious summer, gave the tired Americans a heartening victory, and the proud Japanese a sound spanking." Thanks for watching our video. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to all our Dark Documentaries channels. And if you enjoy epic military stories, make sure to hit the bell icon to be notified of our newest content. Stay tuned.